The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Tonight, the Government of Ontario has a new cabinet sworn in earlier this week, and John Michael McGrath and yours truly will give it the once-over as we consider the Ford team's next moves. OnPoli is next. Hey, partner.
Hello,
a little sugar off the top, as always.
Always.
I love the T-shirt today. Join the resistance.
Yes. So for people listening at home, this is a stylized insignia from the Rebel Alliance in Star Wars with a little bit of a maple leaf on it as well.
And what could that possibly refer to?
Oh, I have no idea what in current events Canadians might have some thoughts about resisting, but I'm not the only one wearing a good T-shirt.
I went into the attic again. It's amazing how many of these souvenirs I apparently kept over the years. There's two reasons I'm wearing this. 23 years ago, this week, the Progressive Conservatives had a leadership convention to replace Mike Harris, and it was Ernie Eves, Jim Flaherty, Tony Clement, Elizabeth Whitmer, and Chris Stockwell all vying for the title. Remember how I said last week that history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes?
Yes.
Okay, there were a lot of rhymes from that convention to what we're seeing now. Ernie Eves went into this convention as kind of the inevitable winner, and he won on the second ballot. That was what the federal Liberal leadership was like a couple of weeks ago, if I recall. There was an inevitability about who was going to win that. 2 weeks ago, the Liberals picked a guy who didn't have the seat in the legislature. 23 years ago, the PCs picked a guy who did not have a seat in the legislature. Ernie Eves had left public life, and he had returned to private life. In the private sector, he was a Bay Street rainmaker. Unlike Mark Carney, who we expect to call an election on Sunday, Ernie Eves got one of his backbenchers to resign, created a by-election. He ran in the by-election, won the by-election, and then stayed on for a year and a half as premier before calling the election, which he then lost to Dalton McGuinty. And I remember talking to Mr. Eves many years after the fact. And I said to him, what was the big mistake? And he said, I should have called a snap election right after I won the damn leadership. And, the fact is, he was never more popular than he was on day one. We had SARS, we had mad cow disease, we had that blackout on the northeastern, region of North America. The news just was worse and worse and worse all the time he held office. So you just never know about these things. David Peterson called an early election in 1990, lost. John Turner called a snap election in 1984, lost. Pierre Trudeau called a snap election in 1968, won a majority.
Yeah.
Ernie Eves did not call a snap election in 2002, ended up losing. Mark Carney, likely to call a snap election on Sunday night? Yeah. We shall see.
Yeah, it's been an interesting year, right? Because, one could argue that Doug Ford has disproven or forced us to revise our beliefs about Ontario politics, right? Ever since David Peterson called that early election, the thinking has been voters will punish you. The Tories did not get the magnitude of win that they wanted in this election, but the voters also clearly didn't punish them very severely for it. Right. And now we will get to assess whether a snap election is in fact the right call. I also just want to add very briefly that 2002 Progressive Conservative Leadership Convention was, I'm almost certain, the very first political convention I was ever present for. I was not working it in a normal sense. I was there with my dad. But I did attend, and one of my earliest memories of not quite covering politics, but there was a moving scrum as, I don't know if you recall, but before the last ballot results were actually announced, Jim Flaherty effectively conceded to Ernie Eves, and he moved across the convention floor. And this is exactly the kind of event that you miss most when you talk about how superior delegated conventions are.
You are totally right about
that. And I got physically bowled over by the moving scrum as people were trying to question Flaherty on his way to Eves. And also, because this is the kind of thing that happens in these kind of live events, a person in a wheelchair also nearly got bowled over. That was another one of those memories that's stuck in my head.
Well, 23 years later, you still remember all this, whereas yes, with all these one-member, one-vote conventions, the next week people have forgotten everything because they're so undramatic.
Yes.
Anyway, with that, let's get off to issue one. Almost 3 weeks ago, Doug Ford won his third consecutive majority government, and on Wednesday of this week, he finally decided to unveil the first cabinet of this, our 44th Parliament. JMM, it still has 37 ministers, including the Premier. That is obviously too many for us to go through here, every single one to say who's where. But why don't you take us through some of the more relevant changes?
Right. So the biggest change here is the Education Ministry, which, full disclosure, TVO reports to the Education Ministry. So Jill Dunlop had been the Education Minister. Paul Calandra is the new Education Minister. Education, the second largest portfolio in Cabinet behind healthcare. So this is a pretty substantial promotion for Calandra. As dear as municipal affairs and housing is to my heart, it's not the most prominent ministry. So that's a pretty notable change, probably the largest change of this week. Jill Dunlop, for her part, is now the Minister of Emergency Preparedness and Response. Todd McCarthy is now the Minister of Environment, Conservation and Parks. Also, that ministry will now be in charge of conservation authorities. I believe they used to report to municipal affairs, but they have lost a lot of their planning powers under this government, so arguably fits more comfortably in with conservation and parks. Speaking of municipal affairs, Rob Flack is now the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing. Stephen Lecce is still the Minister of Energy, but he is now also the Minister of Energy and Mines. He is also getting responsibility for broadband expansion and connectivity. I don't quite know what is behind there. Off the top of my head, I think you're going to see some similarity between the, like when we roll broadband cables out to rural areas, we already have like a lot of Hydro One corridors, that kind of thing. I think there might be some work going on there. Mike Harris, the son of the former premier, he gets a pretty big promotion from the Ministry of Red Tape Reduction, which, despite its title, is not like the most important ministry.
Not even a real ministry, but anyway.
Yeah, exactly. He is being promoted to the Minister of Natural Resources.
Which is a real ministry.
Which is a real ministry, and particularly in Northern Ontario, a very important ministry. And the new person in the cabinet who was not in the previous one is Z. Hamid, who becomes the Associate Minister for Auto Theft and Bail Reform.
Now, because this isn't really a new government, we've got the same party in power, just renewing its mandate, a lot of people stayed where they were. And let me give a fast list here of who didn't go anywhere. Sylvia Jones, still Deputy Premier and Minister of Health. Peter Bethlen-Falvey, still Minister of Finance. Caroline Mulrooney, still President of the Treasury Board, Minister of Francophone Affairs. Michael Kersner, still Solicitor General. Natalia Kuzendova-Bashta, still Long-Term Care Minister. And let me add one more note about those four. Bethlen-Falvey, Mulrooney, Kersner, Kuzendova-Bashta, they all took the oath of office in both of Canada's official languages. Yep. They were the only ones. So good for them. Yeah. That's a nice thing. Vic Fedeli, still Minister of Economic Development. Doug Downey, still the Attorney General. Kinga Surma, still Minister of Infrastructure. David Piccini, still the Minister of Labor. Stan Cho, still Minister of Tourism, Culture and Gaming. And how about this? Raymond Cho, still the Minister of Seniors and Accessibility. He is 88 years old. He is obviously the oldest cabinet minister ever in Ontario history. And of course, the oldest active MPP in Ontario history. 88 years old, be 89 in November. So the Premier loves Raymond Cho. He's always in cabinet.
Yes. Well, and they know each other from Toronto City Council back in the day. So did you notice anything, quirky or different in this time around?
Because this is Ontario, and therefore swearing in ceremonies are often incredibly boring. So I try to find...
We try to make politics interesting, but boy, some days.
It's a lift. It's a heavy lift. So I'm looking for stuff off the path from time to time. And strangely enough, and I hope people aren't going to get mad at me if I point this out, it's just an observation. Yeah. You can kind of find out who believes in God and who doesn't in the way that they accept their new responsibilities, because you have the option as an Ontario minister of swearing an oath to God with your hand on whatever book is important to you.
Yes.
Or you can simply affirm that you are going to accept all these responsibilities that you are about to undertake. So I note, without prejudice, Michael Parsa, who's still the Minister of Children, Community and Social Services. Greg Rickford, still the Minister of Indigenous Affairs. Prabmeet Sarkaria, still the Minister of Transportation. None of them said, "So help me God," at the end. Yeah. And they all just affirmed. So there, for whatever it's worth.
Yeah, and I think there's a few interesting things here. One, Greg Rickford, the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, I don't know if this was what Rickford was thinking. Maybe he's an atheist. I actually have not asked him about this, but there is an idea that he could be sensitive towards Indigenous communities in this province by not bringing in the baggage of Christian history, right? Like residential schools were run by Christian denominations, and not associating your title as the Minister of Indigenous Affairs with religious doctrine or whatever. That might be a form of sensitivity to the communities that Rickford is responsible for. And of course, I mean, Prabhat Sarkaria is a Sikh.
Yeah.
So, he may simply have chosen not to use the language that is inevitably, drawn from
Judeo-Christian tradition.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
But they are all, of course, swearing. Well, they are all serving in the government of the King, His Majesty Charles III, who is still
Head of the Church of England,
a defender of the faith.
That's
right.
That's right. Yeah.
These details.
I remember the first time I saw this happen. I think I'm right about this. The first time I saw a minister sworn in without "So help me God," I think was Floyd Loughran 35 years ago. He was Bob Rae's Minister of Finance. This is in the NDP government of 1990. And I remember at the time, some of us in the press gallery were sort of, whispering to each other. He didn't say "So help me God." It was noticeable by its exclusion. And now, of course, as we just suggested, many ministers do it. So a sign that the times they are a-changing.
Yes, indeed. Can we talk for a moment about how the opposition parties reacted?
We talked last week about the fact that we noticed that Doug Ford put out a press release after Mark Carney won the federal Liberal leadership. And even though they're in different parties, Premier Ford the statement said something like, "Welcome to the fray and congratulations on your victory. Look forward to working with you," yada, yada, yada. And, it's kind of like the classy civil thing you do on day one. Yeah. And I note on day one for this new Ford cabinet, I thought the NDP actually caught the spirit of the moment, which was to say congratulations to the new ministers on their portfolios. And of course, we will be watching and making sure that you do your job. But there was a note of civility there on day one, which I think should be encouraged. I think we're allowed to do that, be civil on day one. Compare that with the Liberals, who I thought, just put out the kind of same boilerplate, nasty, pinched kind of comment, which was, this is a failed cabinet and, essentially, realigning the deck chairs on the Titanic and nothing new here. And, anyway, I just thought it was overly negative for a government that has just been reelected with a majority government. And, we can afford for one day to be a little bit civil in this business. That was my view.
It does intrigue me to think how the different parties are reading the mood of the moment.
Yes.
Right? I think just based on those reactions, the NDP are taking a bit of a breather, if I could put it that way, from the most combative forms of politics.
For one day anyway.
For one day. And the Liberals maybe are reading their base differently and suggesting that their base still wants to see, fists up, like, keep fighting. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're both reading their bases correctly. Right?
Yeah.
But we will see how this goes.
But my comment on civility stands, notwithstanding.
And that's fair.
Can I do one more thing on this?
Sure.
Because this is a good opportunity, given that we just had the swearing in this past week of two cabinets, actually, federal and provincial. I always remember the funniest moment I ever saw in a cabinet swearing in. It was a guy named Ted McMeekin, who's from Hamilton. He was a minister in the McGuinty and Wynne governments. And
he's now a city councillor in Hamilton, right?
Also city councillor, that's right. By inserting a comma in a very strategic place, he gave the oath a whole new meaning. And, you've got to remember here, they say something like, "I swear to execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as minister of whatever, whatever, so help me God." And Ted McMeekin, who was about to get a promotion to a much more difficult portfolio, and everybody knew it, said, "I swear to execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, so..." And then he looked up to the heavens and he said, "Help me, God." It was just a great moment. And I always thought I remembered him doing it, and I just wanted to check. So I emailed him this week and I said, "Do I remember that correctly?" And he said, "Yes, you do." And that comma made all the difference.
Before we leave issue one, seems like we can't go a week without having to talk about this. The President of the United States reiterated his concerns about making Canada a 51st state. The Premier had a response to that again this week, and I believe we've got a clip.
I kind of flip this around. What a compliment. We'll never be a 51st state. Canada's not for sale. But isn't it nice that someone thinks we have the greatest country in the world and they want access? And my simple answer to that is, you want access, let's build an AMCAN fortress that I've been saying.
Well, there's a guy trying to, extend the olive branch again by putting a different spin on this 51st state business. I got to say, I know the Premier's hot on his ANCAM idea, where we can sort of exclude Mexico and create this new America-Canada trading bloc. I mean,
no sign of it.
It's going nowhere.
Anywhere
I'm sorry, Premier. It's absolutely going nowhere. Yeah. Washington isn't the slightest bit interested. They want Fortress America, and to hell with the rest of the world. So, I mean, keep trying, I guess, but it's not.
I'm not sure I've got any better ideas, but we'll just. I'm not optimistic.
Yeah. Anyway, stick around, everybody, because we're going to have some more comments on the fact that we had 2 cabinets sworn in this past week, Doug Ford's and, of course, Mark Carney. So hang around for that. And in the meantime, I'm off to camera 2 and issue 2 right after this. A group of cyclists has lost a legal battle to prevent the provincial government from removing bike lanes in Toronto. Now the removals could go ahead next month. JMM, bring us up to speed on this, if you would, pun intended.
I'm trying to think of a gearing pun.
You just did it.
So last November, the government passed Bill 212, the Reducing Gridlock, Saving You Time Act. They love those bill titles. The bill allowed for the removal of 3 major bike lanes in Toronto on Bloor Street, Yonge Street, and University Avenue. It also requires municipalities to seek permission to install a new bike lane if it means losing a lane of car traffic. So a group called Cycle Toronto brought this legal challenge forward. They have succeeded in getting the courts to hear the issue, but what they had wanted last week was an injunction to stop the government from removing these bike lanes while the court hears the full matter.
And they didn't get the injunction.
They did not. When courts consider a legal injunction, they apply a test, and the test is basically you have to prove that there is a serious issue to be tried, that you're not just wasting the court's time. Then you also have to the court also has to determine who is going to suffer the most harm. And you might think, well, the government's own evidence suggested that cyclists would be put at the risk of physical harm here. What the court actually decided was that the legal precedent requires that the court assume that laws are being executed in good faith and for the public interest, and that on that basis, it didn't feel like it had sufficient grounds to grant the injunction.
Well, here's a little interesting postscript, in as much as I know you and I are pests when it comes to things like facts.
Yes.
So we love decisions that are actually based in fact, and I'm not sure this one was. I mean, what have we learned?
Right. So as part of the legal proceeding, the Cycle Toronto gets to require that the government bring documents forward in terms of its own internal research. And government documents revealed that the province knows that these bike lane removals will not ease congestion, that building the lanes on secondary roads, as the Premier has proposed, will be difficult and in some cases not possible, that collisions for all road users will go up by something like 54% in the government's estimation when the bike lanes are removed. This is not science commissioned by, Vegan Cyclist Communist Incorporated. This is the government's own research suggesting this, and those reports have clearly given Cycle Toronto a lot of ammunition in this fight.
Well, the Premier knows what his base thinks about bike lanes, and they don't love them. So out they cut. Mind you, what's funny? We're here 100 yards south of Yonge and Eglinton, right?
Yes.
And there are bike lanes on Eglinton.
Yes.
So we see what's going on Eglinton Avenue West, one of the major east-west thoroughfares of the capital city. We see it all the time. There are bike lanes there, and bless me if I've ever seen anybody use them ever. And yet the Eglinton bike lanes are in, and no plans, I guess, to take them out.
Well, and additionally, I do think the government would have a hard time blaming the Eglinton bike lanes for congestion after the decade of crosstown construction.
Good point. Good point. We got a little postscript on this as well. We received an email from a listener named, let me get his name right here, Ivan Mirko Senjanovic. I hope I'm saying that correctly, who wrote in about why he thinks, remember, the Tories only lost 2 former sitting members on Election Day, and Christine Hogarth in Etobicoke Lakeshore was one of them. Yvonne posits that it was the bike lane issue that actually did her in, because she barely won. I think she won by less than 1,000 votes 2.5 years ago, and then on election day she lost big this time, several thousands of votes. So why don't you read the email?
Right. So Mirko writes, apart from the Minister of Transportation and the Premier himself, former MPP Hogarth was the most vocal member of the government threatening to rip out bike lanes, both during the whole Bill 212 boondoggle and during her campaign, going as far as making it the number one promise in her literature. And I believe we've got a shot of the pamphlet.
There it is right there.
There we go. By doing this, she turned her candidacy into a mini referendum on the question of bike lanes in Toronto. So a movement was launched to support the Liberal candidate, Lee Fairclough, as the most likely person to oust Christine Hogarth. This is Yvonne saying this again. I personally donated my $200 provincial check to this, even though I live in a completely different Toronto riding. Hopefully this helps Doug Ford and members of the government realize spreading falsehoods about bike lanes and targeting vulnerable traffic participants for political gain is a losing strategy. Cheers, Yvonne Mirko S.
Interesting.
Yvonne also sent us some Reddit threads where many users were saying that they were going to donate their checks from Doug Ford to the Liberal campaign in Etobicoke Lakeshore. So it does seem to have been a bit of a movement there.
And Lee Fairclough was the beneficiary of that movement.
Yes.
There we go.
Really.
She's the new MPP for Etobicoke Lakeshore.
Yeah.
And with that, we're moving on to issue 3. This past week, his first week as Canada's 24th Prime Minister, Mark Carney traveled to Europe, met with the leaders of the UK and French governments, then went to the far north of Canada to announce billions in spending for a new defense system that we would purchase from Australia, not America. And I think we know why.
Yes.
Let's do something a bit different here. It is very unusual to have a new federal cabinet and a new provincial cabinet sworn in the same week. So let's do some comparing and contrasting. For 40 million people, the Liberal Mark Carney swore in a cabinet of 24 ministers, including himself. For 16 million people, the Conservative Doug Ford swore in a cabinet of 37 ministers, including himself. Now, there are obviously no rules about how big or how small your cabinet has to be, but what's going on here? The math is a bit odd.
Yes, so clearly Mark Carney trying to show that there's a bit of a new sheriff in town. Under Justin Trudeau, the Liberals were criticized for spending more money than their Conservative critics would have preferred. So this is a leaner, more focused government, or at least that's the image that Carney is trying to portray. And as I say, trying to turn a page on that appearance of the Trudeau government.
Conversely, if we look at Doug Ford, who's now on his third majority government, unlike Carney, because it's a majority, he has a lot more backbenchers to placate. So Ford has also figured out that trying to give MPPs a raise may be a difficult political lift right now. So he has chosen a different route to give his backbenchers a pay boost, and that is just simply make almost everybody either a parliamentary assistant or a cabinet minister, which is why you get a minister responsible for mines and an associate minister for energy-intensive industries. You get a minister of municipal affairs and housing, and you get an associate minister of municipal affairs and housing. In fact, I counted them up, there are 8 associate ministers in Ford's cabinet, everything from auto theft and bail reform to small business to women's and social and economic opportunities, which incidentally is a portfolio that Mark Carney got rid of.
Yes, and it's faced some criticism for that.
Absolutely, yeah. But this is a tried, tested, and true way of keeping the backbench happy and giving them a sense that if they play the cards right, because cabinet's so big, they may actually get a shot to be in cabinet too. Of course, a 37-member deliberative body is a rather significant sized one, and it would seem to me that it would be a fairly unwieldy decision-making body compared to a 24-member cabinet. But, of course, these numbers reflect the different priorities that the 2 first ministers have.
Your point about a deliberative body of 37 members, I mean, Doug Ford's cabinet is substantially larger than the Toronto City Council that he cut in half.
Interesting,
right?
right? Isn't that interesting?
24, 25 members of Toronto City Council. Mm-hmm. Anyway, there is one other point I want to make about Mark Carney's cabinet, because there's an Ontario angle or even an onpoli angle to this, to one of the new names and faces in Carney's cabinet. Ariel Kayabaga, the MP for London West, is one of the new faces we saw last week. Kayabaga first won her seat in 2021, but prior to that, she was a London City Councillor. She won her council seat in 2018, in the first, last, and so far only municipal election in Ontario that used rank ballots to elect city councillors. The Ford government, after they won in 2018, prohibited municipalities from using ranked ballots ever again. Kayabaga, for her part, has repeatedly said that ranked ballots were one of the big reasons why she chose to run in the first place. And so she has credited ranked ballots for giving her political career a start in that sense. So I think it's noteworthy that not only is she in cabinet, she's the government House leader, and the ministerial title that she holds is Minister of Democratic Institutions. And I will be watching with interest to see what direction Mark Carney goes on matters of democratic reform.
But given that cities and towns are creations of the province,
yes,
she does not have the authority to tell the Premier of Ontario, I want ranked ballots in for your next elections.
Correct. I mean, I guess they could do it in the territories, but no, they can't dictate to the provinces what kind of municipal institutions they can implement. But as I think was that last week where I talked about the prospects of electoral reform provincially, like this debate is not ending anytime soon.
Right.
And I believe Mark Carney sometime in the last year has said that, he is open to electoral reform. He doesn't think that the Prime Minister should dictate it. But as I say, I don't think this discussion is over.
Indeed, it is not. This discussion is over, but it starts a new one. Your column, my column, coming right up. Time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for the TVO website over the past week. What do you got for us?
Right, so we were just talking about Mark Carney's cabinet. The first official act of Mark Carney's cabinet was to functionally eliminate the consumer-facing carbon tax. As of, I guess, April 1st, it will no longer apply. And so I wrote about what I think are the two big questions that this last sort of decade in Canadian politics and the carbon tax will leave us. One is, I think, pretty straightforward. If the carbon tax is dead, what climate policy will we replace it with? One of those possible answers is we just won't, and we will have less effective climate policy. The Financial Accountability Officer estimates that just in Ontario and just looking at provincial and municipally owned infrastructure, the costs of climate change are going to be somewhere between $4 and $7 billion annually by the end of this century. So that adds up to a lot of money. And that doesn't even count costs to things like private property, right? Like when your basement floods because of a massive rainstorm that you were not planning for. So we have to deal with climate policy, whether we have a carbon tax or not. The second question is a bit more weedsy, and I am going to apologize in advance because this is arcane constitutional stuff, but I think it's important. The structure of the carbon tax. Why was Mark Carney able to zero out the carbon tax at a cabinet meeting? Why didn't he have to pass a bill? Right? We normally think of taxation as one of those key functions that, like, no taxation without representation, right? If you're going to increase or decrease a tax, it should be a vote by MPs or MPPs, right?
As opposed to a signature by the First Minister.
Exactly. The way the Liberal government under Justin Trudeau structured the carbon tax is they delegated that power to cabinet. And when it was challenged at the Supreme Court said, this is constitutionally okay. Fun little note, these kinds of delegations are called Henry VIII clauses. You can guess that Henry VIII was really quite happy when Parliament delegated powers to him. The thing is, okay, carbon tax is dead, fine. In that sense, this is not a huge issue, but we are seeing other governments use these kinds of Henry VIII clauses, including just recently the BC government has introduced a law to respond to tariffs that would give the cabinet really broad powers to create like exemptions and in some cases just ignore provincial legislation. And I'm quite certain that law will get challenged, if for no other reason that some business is going to get treated in a way that they don't think they should be, and they're going to challenge it in court. And it will be really important to see what the courts say about Henry VIII clauses in Canadian law going forward. And so I think those are the two things I will be watching from the death of the carbon tax. And how about you, Steve?
I may be the only person who's still interested in doing postmortems on the Ontario election just happened, but I don't care. I've still got, there's something about that election that still fascinates me, and I want to get this on the record here, and it has to do with strategic voting.
Yeah.
What do I mean about that? Well, okay. For a month straight, during the whole writ period, we heard all of the major opposition parties say how unfit Doug Ford was to govern and to be our premier. But did they cooperate with each other even one little bit to make sure that he would not enjoy a third consecutive majority government? No, they did not. And I explain in my column about how the opposition parties are running, frankly, against each other as much as they're running against Doug Ford. And if they had decided to cooperate just a little bit, they could have defeated him. And I give the example here. There are 6 ridings in the city of Mississauga, 4th biggest city in the province of Ontario. The PCs won only one of those 6 ridings with more than 50% of the vote. What if the NDP had not run candidates in Mississauga where, incidentally, they never win? They take 4, 5, 6% of the vote in every riding. They never win. But what they do is they prevent Liberals from winning seats there, that's for sure. You can make an argument that had the NDP stood down, not run candidates in those 6 ridings, maybe the Liberals would have won 5 of the 6. Maybe they would have won 3 of the 6, but they wouldn't have won 0, which is what they ended up, including, of course, the leader. I'd make the same point about Parry Sound Muskoka. What if the Liberals and New Democrats had not run candidates there? Probably the people who wanted to vote for those candidates would have instead voted for the Green candidate if they wanted to defeat the Progressive Conservative. And instead, that didn't happen. The Green candidate came up just that short, and the Conservatives won the seat. Anyway, you could replicate that idea all over the province of Ontario and have if the opposition parties decided to work together a little bit more, they could defeat the current government, but they choose not to.
Right, but that just sort of begs the question of why are they choosing not to?
Well, I think for a bunch of reasons. Number one, for whatever reason, they all think that they need to run a full slate of candidates to look like they're real serious contenders for government. The fact is, they know, even before the election starts, that more than half the seats they run in, they have no shot of winning whatsoever, unless lightning strikes, which I guess could happen. But for that reason, they run a full slate. There's also another reason, which is they are financially incented to run a full slate. There is a per-vote subsidy that every party gets for every vote that they get. And if they don't run candidates in every riding, they don't get that per-vote subsidy, which is cash in their pockets, even if they have no shot to win the seats. And number 3 here, I think the fact of the matter is that these 3 opposition parties pretty clearly don't like each other more than they dislike the Ford Conservatives. But, the result of their lack of cooperation is that the PCs keep winning majority after majority after majority, which is terrific if you are part of the 43% of Ontarians who voted for the Progressive Conservative Party, but probably not fine for the 57% who did not vote Progressive Conservative. Now, who told me this? I can't remember. Somebody gave me a tip a few days ago about the fact that New Democrat MPP Catherine Fife from Kitchener-Waterloo, she was getting tired of this and she wanted to have a chat with the president of the Liberal Party, Catherine McGarry, about somehow cooperating. That meeting has not happened yet. I noticed Martin Redcon from the Toronto Star got the same tip and he did a column about it the other day. I want to be clear here. I'm not advocating this. I am not saying you opposition parties should be doing this. I am saying, I am hearing from lots of progressive voters all over Ontario who are tired of always splitting their vote, their anti-Tory vote, among the 3 parties, which enables the Conservatives to win. And since, apropos of your previous comments, since we're not about to get electoral reform in the province because the majority government doesn't want it to happen, if you want change, you've got to figure out a way within the current system that we have to make it happen. The New Democrats and the Liberals apparently have no interest in cooperating. The Greens do, actually. The Greens have been open to a conversation, but not the other 2. So I merely say, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different outcome? I'll just leave that out there in the ether for people to consider.
Yeah, I mean, in some U.S. states, there are rules that allow a candidate to have the endorsement of multiple parties. So like in New York State, it's very common for a candidate to be endorsed by both the Democrats and the Working Families Party, I think is the sort of the more left-wing party. And you could imagine a rule allowing that where instead of the NDP and the Liberals competing in every single riding, in some ridings they might have a joint candidate. But I assume that would take legislative change, and I cannot imagine that the current government is interested in that kind of legislative change.
Anyway, that's my post-election comments, and maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll leave it at that from now on. Maybe I'll go find other things to talk about.
So for now, we'll go to the mailbag.
Right on. Let's do that. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love to hear from you at onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, hit me with your rhythm stick.
This is an email from Felix Chase in Flesherton, who writes, and before I actually get into this, I just want to say this one was really delightful. I really liked this one. Felix writes, I just listened to the episode where JMM was wearing an X-Men 97 shirt, and there is a Canadian political connection that you might not be aware of. Rogue's voice actress, and I have to say in parentheses here, Rogue is one of the characters from X-Men for those who are not enlightened. Rogue's voice actress, Lenore Zann, was elected 3 times as an NDP MLA in Nova Scotia, and she came in second in a bid for party leader. She was then elected as a Liberal MP in 2019, but lost re-election in 2021. Felix Chase from Flesherton,
Did you know that?
I had no idea. This one was
That's
like
a cool piece of trivia.
Yeah, no, I really, really like this one. Certainly I had no idea when I was wearing the shirt, and like, I really wish I had. But yeah, no, as both a fan of the X-Men comics, the X-Men cartoon, and now Canadian politics, that's really delightful.
Everything connects.
Yeah, that Venn diagram.
Everything connects. It really does. Give the email address if you would, sir, and let's get out of here.
Absolutely. If you'd like to ask about content on the show, you can email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, March 21st, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Shout out to Gil, who's on audio this week. And Gil, thanks a lot for your contribution to our little program here. Until next Friday, everybody. Bye-bye. How did this story come to you in the first place and inspire you so much that you felt you needed to make a doc about it?
Yeah, I mean, so it goes back about 4 years ago. So we've been on this about 4 years, even though it's a story that goes maybe 60 years back. But Andrew Munger, who's a producer, documentary producer, he had the idea for this and had contacted Jay and then presented it to me as a director on it. And I, right away, like I've got connections to the music and I'm really passionate about the music. So immediately we saw the same vision of the story and helping elevate these stories of Jay and his contemporaries and sort of the cultural influence the music has had on Canadian culture. I also did a 15-year radio show in one of Toronto's probably most predominant Caribbean programmed radio stations back in the day, which is CHRY 105.5 out of York University. And I played the original soul and funk and reggae and ska records. So I was always passionate about learning more about this music. I'm also Jamaican. My mom's from Jamaica. She came up a few years after Jay came up. She immigrated to Canada. So I've always grown up into music and just wanted to discover more of it and just realizing how much there was here in Canada, and that kind of went undiscovered.
Well, that's the point. I mean, you really were a pioneer in getting this music out there, and we're talking 50, 60 years ago right now. What was Toronto like back then?
That's a good question. What you was like, for example, when I came at that time, first thing I noticed was when I came through the custom immigration.
You moved here as a teenager.
Yes, 1964, and my mom came 1954 as a domestic worker. And the questions that were asked of me at immigration, I knew I was in a new environment. And then looking outside, it was in the fall, no leaves on the trees. I said, why, the trees are dying. What happened here? But then again, it was nature, you know, learning how to appreciate the different seasons.
Did you like Toronto when you first got here?
No.
What didn't you like about it?
I did not. I missed the food that I left in the Caribbean. And the cold, because I'm from a tropical climate. But as soon as I got here, my mom told me, she says, listen, you're going to need an education. You need to go to school right away. So then my friend Henry Naylor introduced me to Central Technical High School.
You went to Central Tech?
Central Tech, only to find out it's the largest technical school in the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
So large that in my first week I got lost. So they had to assign a kid to take me around. And then that helped me to adjust to the new environment. Like going around to the church halls on Sunday afternoons, singing with different bands, getting to know the city better. And then back at Central Tech, it was a school anniversary then, so I decided to go and check it out at the auditorium, and they were doing a concert for the anniversary. So I went in and saw a young man with a guitar, say, "Hey man, can you help me? I would love to sing a song for the anniversary show tonight." And he says, "I don't know if I can play what you want, but what do you want to sing?" So I go, "They call it Stormy Monday, and Tuesday just as bad. Lord, Lord of mercy, Lord of mercy upon me." That was the blues. So I sang it at the anniversary show, and then they showed it the Monday morning to the whole school in the auditorium. Man, I was a star. Everybody wants, "Hey, Jay, hey, Sam, we got a band." So then I started playing in the church halls around the city.
Okay, well, that needs a follow-up because as we said off the top, Jay Douglas is not the name you were born with. When and why did you take on the name Jay Douglas?
Man, that's a good question, brother. Ooh. No, that's the question. I'm happy you asked this because in the documentary, it showed where a gentleman by the name of Rick Sands came up to me while we were doing a gig right here in a club called The Generator. It was the hardest club to get booked in because they weren't using local bands, American bands. So we got this gig, and before the opening night in the afternoon, the guys in the band start fighting. And we have a show to do, but I'm a peacemaker because where I came from, try to make peace, make things work. So I went up there and I worked my butt off, but the gentleman was at the back of the room, and when we took our first break, he said, "I want to speak to you. I'm Rick Sands. Come here." He says, "What's wrong with the band? You're working hard, but they're not with it. Were you guys having problems?" We were fighting. He says, "I want you to come and see me next week in my office." He was one of the top agents in Toronto. He says, I want to help you. I don't want the rest of the band. I want you because you're working hard." I said, "But I can't leave the Cougars, man. The Cougars are the..." He says, "Nobody knows you." And that's when I became Jay Douglas.
There we go. Congestion pricing came in January in New York City. It now costs about $9 a day to enter New York during peak hours. The results are in. This is only for January 2025. Let's see what has happened. 1 million fewer vehicles entered the most congested part of Manhattan. Travel times 10 to 30% faster at inbound river crossings. Bus service was faster and more reliable. Ridership on the weekend express bus service grew by more than 20%. In the first 27 days, this program generated apparently almost $50 million, which will go to the region's transit system. And it's on track to hit $500 million by the end of the year, unless President Trump gets his way and he comes in and cancels this. Stay tuned, everybody. Okay, Jennifer, if there's fewer cars on the road now, what happened to all those drivers? Where'd they go?
Well, they're taking the bus. You just saw that in your stats. They're getting on the bus. More people are carpooling. More people are walking to their destinations. And people are changing their travel patterns. That's really one of the most significant things that happens with congestion pricing, is that people think differently about how they're going to commute, when they commute. It's interesting to be implementing this at a moment when most people do have the option, many people do have the option of working from home. So you start to see a big shift in how people think about their commute and when they commute and when they get in their car. You know, years ago when we were advocating for this in the city of Toronto, I was on the CBC and someone called in. You know, we were talking about the power of pricing and congestion relief zones, and someone called in and said, "If you do this, I'm going to have to start carpooling." That's the answer to your question.
And that is what you want.
That's the answer to your question, is that you change behavior by putting a price on something. And look, 20% increase in the number of people taking the bus in New York City. That is a really significant and transformative shift in modal split that transportation planners, you know, spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to tweak routes, how to improve service, how to get the pricing right in order to see that kind of a transition. So I think what we've seen, and we've already seen it for decades in London, and we've seen it in Singapore, and we've
London,
seen it
UK. They've
London,
had it.
UK, in Singapore, in Stockholm, is that when you introduce pricing, that you start to mix up how people think about using road infrastructure, and that's really powerful.
We should just say modal split is what people like you call those who drive versus those who take transit. Just a little translation there. Is this a good or bad news story?
The New York story is a great news story. It's working, and it's also changing minds and attitudes. When it first came in, people in New York City were generally opposed. You're starting to see the favorability go up. People see that it works, and that's been the pattern all around the world. London, Stockholm, Milan, Singapore. When these charging programs are first introduced, they're often unpopular. People are worried about how they are going to get around, if they're going to be priced off the road. And over time, when they see the results, that's what's so key about this. It's not just a new tax. It's actually improving and changing people's lives and experiences in cities. And when they start to see the positive results, then the favorability goes up, and people in polls and even in elections. In Stockholm, they had an election after it got brought in. Charging got brought in as a pilot, and afterwards they had an election, and it won, and it got maintained. So you can really start to see how people view their lives changing for the better, and these programs are working.
Teresa, same question. Is this a good or bad news story?
I think the New York story is a very interesting, because often we hear people say, oh, that's London or that's Singapore, but I think a lot of people in Toronto can feel more like-minded with New York City, right? It's a busy, bustling city, bigger than Toronto even. But, and so I think people are going to, once they hear about it, I don't think a lot of people in Toronto actually know about New York's congestion program. And then I think right now too, it's early. So people want to see some proof, and I think it's an interesting telltale for what could or could not happen in Toronto. That being said, there are some things that need to happen before you implement something like this.
So let me ask the obvious follow-up, which is you're here representing the Canadian Automobile Association. Mm-hmm. So do we assume that drivers are not happy about having to pay this money to go into the city?
Well, I think at CA, we always focus on safety, but we talk to our members about some of these issues like congestion pricing, how people get around. So our members get around by car, they get around by bike, they take transit, they walk, and we've definitely seen a huge shift in some of those ways of getting around since the pandemic. But in generally, if you ask people if they're supportive of tolls or congestion charges, no, they're not.
Right.
And I think that's something that we've talked about over a number of years, is what has to be in place, because otherwise it's just seen as very punitive. And currently we've got a lot of transit being built, which is really a precursor to how you get people to change their transportation behaviors or how they get around, but we don't have it where it needs to be yet in order to even bring in something at this point.
So Yan, let me ask you, how much appetite for a genuinely bilingual country are you picking up in the country these days?
Well, not much. In part because, let's be honest, to learn another language demands a real effort. I happen to learn the two, and I speak Spanish too, because I was living in those countries. I mean, you can't live 10 years in France without picking up French. You can't, if your parents speak French to you, necessarily learn French. And then I went to school in English. But otherwise, I said in Saskatoon, l'assimilation est galopante. It's very hard to speak French in Saskatoon. You can try to learn it in school, but then as soon as you leave the school, everything's in English. Radio, television, everyone on the street, sports, everything's in English. So it demands a real effort. Is there an appetite for that effort? I'm not sure. Other than in Quebec, and that's the one thing about separatism, is it took all of francophoneness to itself and abandoned everyone beyond the Quebec border. The federal government has made a valiant effort. Supposedly when you go to Canada Post, you can speak French. Well, really, but then they make that effort. But I don't think there's a real appetite, no. But is that the end of the world? I mean, let's take the example of the Irish or the indigenous people, which is totally ignored in the Two Solitudes thing. Of course, they don't even talk about the indigenous people. Many of them, the Irish and the indigenous people of North America, have lost their native languages, and yet they didn't lose their culture necessarily. They're trying to bring that back. But can they bring back the dozens and dozens and dozens of indigenous languages that were spoken in Canada? Probably not. But they can certainly rescue their culture, and to me, that's the essential thing. I disagree with what you said about the English and I mean culture and language being together. English, for example, there's not one English, there's dozens of English. Jamaican English is totally different from, Australian English, from North American English. English is an example of a language as a tool that can adapt itself to any number of cultures, and any language can do that. So I think the indigenous people of Saskatchewan, for example, speak wonderful English, but they're completely indigenous. They're bringing back their indigeneity, but just happen to using the tool called English. They strip away all the English stuff out of it, but they use it as a tool to express themselves. I think there's real appetite for that, for cultural survival. Linguistic survival, the only province that I remember as a writer seeing as being genuinely bilingual was New Brunswick. That's the only place that I've done an event that was both in English et en français. J'ai fait un événement à Moncton.
Le Fry Festival.
Le Fry Festival. J'ai fait un événement qui était tout à fait bilingue. On posait une question en anglais, une question en français. Et les spectateurs devaient se débrouiller.
Could you say the same thing about French, though? The French I hear in Northern Ontario does not sound the same as the French I would hear in Quebec or in New Brunswick or in Paris, France.
Yeah, no. Every language can adapt to where it is. Like any animal, we adapt ourselves. So, but as I said, to keep a language alive demands a real... It's like learning an instrument. If you play the violin, it's great. You also want to learn the oboe? Go ahead. That's really hard.
Je vais juste être un peu en désaccord parce que l'expérience au Québec, moi je vois, et vous avez fait allusion à ça au début, c'est qu'il y a l'évolution de cette solitude culturelle, dans le sens qu'on ne peut pas apprécier la culture québécoise sans connaître le français. Parce que la télévision, la radio, les revues, tout qui est en français, si on n'est pas quelqu'un qui parle le français, on n'est pas bilingue, on ne peut pas s'immerser dans la culture. Et je suis d'accord avec les communautés autochtones, c'est sûr qu'ils préservent la culture sans avoir la langue, mais même là, il y a une difficulté parce que la tradition est orale avec ces communautés. Ils n'ont pas d'écrits qui peuvent être traduits, par exemple. Il faut avoir quelqu'un qui parle pour savoir l'histoire, qu'elle soit après peut-être transcrite en anglais. Alors là, il y a aussi un mouvement de ces communautés-là pour préserver la langue parce que pour pleinement apprécier la culture, une connaissance au moins de base de la langue est nécessaire. Et au Québec, on voit ça, on a tout un star system complètement différent que dans le reste du Canada, qui est en français. And the people who are in that star system, they are French speakers, but they can't be appreciated fully if you can't speak some French. So, and people won't watch. They won't watch TV if they're an English-speaking Quebecer. Sometimes they won't watch French TV because they can't
They don't get
engage.
it.
They don't get it. Yeah.
Puis je me demande si on pourrait être franco-ontarien sans parler français ou sans au moins comprendre le français, parce que ce qu'on produit comme culture, comme recherche, bien, ça se fait essentiellement en français et c'est très rarement traduit. Donc, qui perd la langue perd l'identité culturelle en grande partie. C'est pas nécessairement le cas en Acadie.
J'allais pour dire.
Où,
le Congrès mondial acadien, par exemple, c'est un événement qui, dépendamment de la région où ça se tient, quand même bilingue. Les fêtes de famille, avec justement des gens qui viennent de la Louisiane notamment, ou de la Nouvelle-Angleterre. Souvent, c'est des gens qui ont perdu le français depuis plusieurs générations, mais qui se réclament encore de l'identité acadienne. Mais il reste que pour participer à la société civile acadienne aujourd'hui, si on ne parle pas français, on va rester très marginal.
C'est ça. Et c'est la différence avec l'Ontario français, qui a une identité qui est très civique, très peu ancrée dans l'ethnicité canadienne-française. Donc, on va entendre dire des gens « My parents were French » or « My grandmother was French but I'm not French », right? Even if they are Franco-Ontarian ethnically, for example.
Est-ce qu'il ne faudrait pas sensibiliser les anglophones au risque qu'encourt la langue française de disparaître s'il n'y a pas un cadre pour la protéger?
La question est bonne et c'est une réflexion que je me suis souvent faite, par exemple, par rapport au programme d'immersion. On sait qu'il y a des écoles d'immersion partout au Canada. Les parents font la ligne pour avoir une place pour leurs enfants. Mais, par exemple, les chansons qu'on apprend, les comptines qu'on apprend à ces petits-enfants-là ne sont pas les comptines que nous, on a appris dans les écoles françaises, par exemple. C'est comme si on avait créé une culture francophone pour les petits anglophones du Canada qui veulent apprendre le français. Et ça me sidère. On a des belles comptines, pourquoi est-ce qu'on ne les partage pas? Et il y a, je pense, des associations culturelles sur le terrain qui font cet effort-là. Je pense par exemple au Théâtre français de Toronto ici, qui présente du théâtre en français avec des sous-titres en anglais. par exemple, pour que ça soit plus inclusif, pour que les francophiles ou même les anglophones qui sont intéressés par ces pièces de théâtre-là, mais qui ne se sentiraient peut-être pas à l'aise d'écouter cette pièce-là, cette pièce de théâtre-là sans avoir un appui, peut-être qu'on ne les verrait pas chez nous. Mais d'un autre côté, il y a un danger à ouvrir ces portes-là. Puis on l'a vu, par exemple, avec l'expérience des écoles bilingues dans les années 1970, surtout dans les milieux où la langue majoritaire est l'anglais, c'est que ces écoles-là devenaient des foyers d'assimilation. D'avoir et de maintenir des espaces d'autonomie, des espaces publics qui sortent de l'extérieur du foyer familial, où les choses se passent en français, ça demeure primordial. Et c'est là où je pense qu'il y a une tension qui n'est pas facile pour les francophones en situation minoritaire de dire, oui, on veut être ouvert, on veut être inclusif, mais au détriment de quoi? Et là, il y a toujours des réflexions à faire, je pense, mais de trouver le juste équilibre, c'est franchement pas facile.
You know what I'm noticing, which is kind of funny? I know we're going back and forth between French and English, and I don't know if anybody in the control room is running a stopwatch on this, but it feels like a lot more French is being spoken here than English, and I think it's because French is just a lot more fun to speak than English. Do you think that's happening?
Actually, Steve, it's so you don't understand what we're saying.
Maybe that's
I'm
why it's
picking up
fun.
more of this than you think. It's not too bad.
Une des choses, en fait, un des problèmes, je crois, c'est la nature même de la langue. Le fait est que l'anglais, de par son histoire, et c'est plus facile d'apprendre l'anglais. Par exemple, au début de l'émission, je demandais à nos invités, est-ce que je vous vois ou je vous tutoie? Cette petite nuance est perdue en anglais. Une chose de moins à apprendre pour bien parler anglais. En anglais, c'est you. Que ce soit la reine ou le dieu ou mon enfant, c'est you.
It's His Majesty.
It's his majesty.
And that is the agenda for Friday, March 21st, 2025. Monday on the program, Ontario Place is the subject of a new TVO original documentary called Your Tomorrow. And we'll sit with the director and others to discuss this beloved provincial crown jewel. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org. Have a great weekend, everybody. We'll see you again on Monday.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.